Thanks everyone for attending today's webinar. It's so great to see so many people and from across the country. We called this webinar Deepening the Conservation Conversation because we wanted to create a space to explore in a deeper and a broader way what we talk about when we talk about urban nature and biodiversity. And maybe even to get a little philosophical and kind of question what those terms mean and how we as urban dwellers relate to them in our daily lives. So hopefully by the end of this hour, we'll have learned some new things, maybe challenged some of our own thinking, and hopefully come away a bit inspired. The topic stems from work we published in our Canadian City Parks Report in July of 2020. And this is our national report that's made possible by the Weston Family Foundation. And it's looking at the trends and challenges in different Canadian cities. And in the 2020 report, we had 27 cities represented. In that report, we did focus in on urban biodiversity and its relationship to climate resilience, to human well-being, to Indigenous land stewardship, and to working towards more equitable cities. So through that work, we collected city data across those cities. We reported on stories happening from across the country. And we also published an online biodiversity resource library. And in that library, we linked to the research that we pulled together, which includes research reports, but it also includes a kind of library of Canadian city strategies and planning documents about biodiversity and environmental planning. It's a really great resource, and you can find that resource, but also all the stories and data that we pulled together at cityparksreport.parkpeople.ca. Maybe Molly or Rachel can drop that link in the chat. So if you haven't visited the site yet, I encourage you to kind of poke around after the panel. Each one of our panelists today actually had their work featured in the report, and so it's really exciting for me to bring them together here today for a conversation. And before we get started, I'm just going to briefly introduce each panelist, and then we'll get started in the and you'll be able to find their full bios on our website, and I believe Rachel is going to drop that link into the chat as well. So I encourage you to check out their full bios. So with us today, we have Nadha Hassen, who's a public health researcher and Ph.D. student and Vanier scholar at York University's Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. We have Dawn Carruthers Hoed, who's a senior fellow and manager of the Canadian Parks Collective for Innovation and Leadership. We have Jennifer Ray Pierce, who is the Partnerships and Engagement Head at the Urban Biodiversity Hub, which I've heard her call Hub, which I love, and is a Ph.D. candidate at the School of Community and Regional Planning at the University of British Columbia. And we also have Joss Ducros Tremblay, who is an earthworker with the Indigenous Land Stewardship Circle and a multimedia artist. So again, please check out their full bios. It's really an amazing group of people. So grateful to have them here today, and we will get started. And I think, I wanted to start off, I said we were going to be a little bit philosophical today. And so I wanted to start off with a kind of broader question to kind of get things flowing. So what do the words biodiversity and nature mean to you? And does that meaning change when we put the word urban in front of them? And maybe we'll start things off just with Nadha.
Hi, Jake. Thanks so much for having me here. I'm really grateful to be a part of this conversation. And as you briefly mentioned, I'm doing my PhD and looking particularly at the links between urban green space and mental health and well-being for racialized populations. So that's sort of where I come at this work from. And so I think we do tend to center humans when we think of well-being. But when I think of biodiversity, I think of natural environments, and I also think about the relationships to other species, to the planet. And I think that comes into play when we think about clean water, food security, climate justice, climate change. And so I think it's a really big topic, and I'm excited to hear about other people's perspectives as well.
Thank you. Dawn, why don't we hear from you next?
Thanks, Jake, and it's a pleasure to be here from Nechathewem in the unceded territory of the coastal Salish First Nations. And to me, biodiversity is, it's literally the variety of life that ensures ecological systems in the earth are resilient to change. And when we bring that into the context of parks, it's such an appealing conversation about social diversity as well. You can't have biodiversity without social diversity. We're all part of that big system of life on earth. And adding urban to that is just such an exciting opportunity to bring in nature at your doorstep. And instead of talking about parks as just experiences of a lifetime, hitting the top of a mountain, having a one-time inclusive opportunity to take a trail rider with a group of friends to the Continental Divide, urban parks allow you to have a lifetime of experiences, this opportunity to connect with biodiversity day by day through the seasons, in good weather and bad weather. And to me, that's the really exciting part of this conversation, is that real opportunity to see people as part of that natural system. And I look forward to the conversation on that theme.
Thank you. Yes, already some collaboration, I think, in thinking here. Joss, why don't we go to you next?
Yeah, it's a great question. Trise, I have come to feel that whether urban is in front of biodiversity or nature doesn't make a tremendous difference in terms of conceptualizing the significance and the differences between biodiversity and nature. From my perspective as Great Lakes Métis or Kichikaming or Shkimatsig of both Okweomwe and Anishinaabe ancestries, indigenous to these lands, and also to Mi'kmaq territories, and of course across the big pond as a battleground of colonization, I have come to see that what is referred to as nature, and that is our relatives in manufactured landscapes, whether they are in the city manufactured landscape or in the very manufactured rural landscapes or industrial agricultural lands, nature has this particular kind of romanticization. It distinguishes what it is to be in relationality with natural relatives or relatives of the natural world. Is curious that we've been separated from those relatives in a human way of thinking about ourselves. Whereas biodiversity, to me, it lights up my spirit. It is the recognition that the more relatives we have in any given space, the more spirit presence we have, the more we're able to feel how we are related and inseparably related in that interplay and that interconnectedness. So to me, biodiversity is critical to how we, as Indigenous peoples or as people of Métissage, connect to all those relatives. The more relatives we can recognize and acknowledge, the more they are showing up in our ceremonies, and the more we are then not making decisions for them, but with them. So this is a little snippet in my sense and feelings about biodiversity as being the complete opposite of, say, for example, a monoculture, which is misperceived, and I think on how people refer to the rurals or the countryside as being like, oh, so beautiful, or McDonald's farm, what have you, and yet we're just looking at a monoculture as far as the eye can see, and that to me is actually horrifying. You wait.
Thank you for that. Jennifer, how about you?
Hello and good morning to everyone. I just want to start by expressing my gratitude for being a part of this conversation and very important dialogue, and also to the Coast Salish peoples who have made it possible for us to live in this amazing place. I am also on Nakhwalalhwam here with Dawn, just by chance. So just want to start with an expression of that gratitude. In terms of when we think about the term biodiversity, when it was first on a large stage, that was in 1986 when the Smithsonian debuted a national forum on biodiversity. So this was the first time it was ever on a big platform like this. And so in advance of this platform, there was a discussion about what biodiversity means. And at that time, the scientists that gathered to define this, they defined it as what they love about nature. So it started as this explicitly emotional, values-based definition. And since that time, it has been tied up in other ideas of what is objective, what can we measure. It became more of this domain of elite experts who would tell you what biodiversity meant, rather than something that you felt as it had begun, and also became tied up in ideas of nature being separate from people, and that nature is something pristine that is somehow marred by a human presence, rather than things being partnership. So the reason why my work has always been in urban biodiversity in particular is because of this idea that when you're thinking of an urban space, it inherently challenges these ideas of what biodiversity means. So when you're looking at an urban space, it's undeniably a human space. And you can't erase humans from an urban environment. And so when we think about urban and biodiversity, we're inherently putting those two things together. So even though you can still do that in other locations, in non-urban locations, it's particularly at the forefront when we're in an urban condition. So that's where I think the conversation gets very interesting. And typical measures of biodiversity in terms of counting species or being very concerned about native species get a bit questioned and criticized in an urban context, which I think is good and helps us balance more this idea of the relationship and the right relationship between human and non-human, both as part of one larger nature, which makes up urban biodiversity.
That's so interesting. I love, the idea of kind of bringing emotion sort of back into our conversations around these things, because I do think that's something that is often lost. And as Joss mentioned as well, like nature is such an emotional part of many of our lives, maybe even more so right now. I'm wondering just if, as a follow-up to some things that people were talking about, does size matter when it comes to these types of spaces? Can we, because I think when people think about naturalized environments, they're often thinking about larger nature parks, maybe outside of cities or on the edge of cities. Does size matter when we're thinking about our relationship to some of these spaces? Can we have sort of that same experience that some of you were talking about in kind of these micro spaces in our very dense neighborhoods? Or do we have to go outside of cities or to larger spaces in order to get the same benefit?
So I think in my experience and in people who have taught me along the way, and in my own graduate work, we worked with elders who talked about how do you come into a space, a natural space, and experience the benefits of it. And it had nothing to do with size. It had everything to do with respect. Are you respecting that space for what it is? Are you respecting those that belong in the space, whether they're human or not human? And I think even more, and where the conversation led and where I really like working today, is that I think wildness counts more than size. Where's the wildness in the space? Where's the places that people can not be in control and see nature functioning around them in ways that are mystical and invigorating and sometimes scary, and you can feel the weather and you can see the things happening around you that remind you that you're alive. And another teacher of mine, Bruce Downey from Yukon Parks, said parks are where you learn to love life, to kind of connect with what Jennifer was saying, this idea that if you can get that appreciation for wildlife, no park is too small.
Does anyone else want to touch on that one before I move on? Joss?
Yo, I totally do. Don. I wanted to also recognize that I didn't place my social location in the previous question. Apologies for that. I just wanted to recognize that I am in what is referred to as Toronto or Downdo, Dolondo, or Takaronto, which is referred to as Treaty 13 territory, but there are actually a number of treaties, from the Jays Treaty, the Haldeman Treaty, Nan Fran, Fort Niagara Treaty, and of course the Dish with One Spoon Wampum that I think is really important. I'm just going to recognize that. I wanted to just share this one piece of consideration. I don't want to go too much into facts, but a fact that I honor, that I learned actually from Arthur Manuel, the late, great Arthur Manuel from West Coast, Wet'suwet'en territories, who shared that 0 point, and all the lands in this nation state of so-called Canada, the land that has been held by Indigenous people through the industrial reservation system makes up only 0.02%. And in fact, it has since been contested that it's less than that. It's closer to zero. I'm just going to write that down. 0.01 to 0.02% that's not a very large number. 0.01 is all of the land held by Indigenous peoples in the reserve land system. And yet they are also recognized as holding 85, up to 85 or more % of the biodiversity in the nation state of Canada. And all of those lands, that 0.01 to 2%, can fit into one Navajo reservation. In fact, it can fit into a Hopi reservation that's inside one of the Navajo reservations. And I mean, that speaks obviously in great volume to the ways in which the nation state of Canada managed Indigenous peoples on their lands, and in particular displaced them, and to recognize too, and I know that it comes up in the report, and I actually will amend the report, that in fact it's well over 50% of Indigenous peoples have been displaced to urban centers. And this at the same time that they are still maintaining 85% of the biodiversity. So just recognizing there are tiny, tiny little parcels of land, often industrialization is happening all around them. They're being poisoned from the waters and the airs, from the mining and fracking and etc. And yet they're still maintaining, because of their cultural practices, their ways, which is the writing of relations, which I come back to, just to say that the size doesn't have to matter. It's about your practices, I really believe. Just want to echo that.
Thank you. Nadha, did you want to add something?
Yeah, thank you to Don and Joss. I think I agree. I think even the research shows, that it's not necessarily about the quantity of the green space or the size of it. It's really about the quality, and there's so many components to that, but biodiversity is also, I think, such a key part of it. And when we're in some of these spaces, I think intuitively we know that there's, we maybe feel better, less stressed, more connected, and maybe we can't quite pinpoint it, but it's still there. And I think that when we think about these relationships, just to put this back into the conversation about how we engage with space, about the history of the land, and if we think about structural systems of colonialism, racism, patriarchy, ableism, and so on, and their intersections, I think we also need to think about how do we navigate some of these relationships and do it meaningfully and respectfully. And just for myself as well, as an immigrant, as a South Asian, being so grateful to be in this city of Toronto, but knowing that there's a history there, and how do we talk about those connections and how do we work together? And I just wanted to put that out there as well.
Jennifer?
So I would agree with everything that the previous panelists have brought up, but one element that hasn't yet been raised is this questioning this concept of small spaces, and the idea that in an urban condition that life exists like islands. So that one traditional, or not really traditional, but hegemonic way of looking at biodiversity in cities is to conceptualize biodiversity as existing in the same way that an island of animals lives in the ocean, such that there are areas that have life, that are biodiverse, where that may belong or may be encouraged, surrounded by areas that are uninhabitable. Whereas there are other ways of thinking about this that they're like more matrix oriented, where the idea is to look at the urban landscape as a whole and to think of it as, from across all of these different areas, whether it's a park or not a park, how conducive it is to life, whether the life is traveling across it or is living on it. So I think that's also important to consider, particularly to a parks audience that may be more accustomed to, just thinking about those spaces that they can more directly manage, rather than to think of the city as a matrix, and how important those spaces in between can be, even in unexpected ways. So I just wanted to kind of raise that concept up as well.
Thank you, Jennifer. Such an important point, and it reminds me of a conversation. I think Pamela's actually on this. I saw her maybe as a participant. Pamela Zevitt, who's the biodiversity planner for the city of Surrey, was talking about thinking about biodiversity as that kind of matrix throughout the whole city, not just within so-called park areas, but also thinking about how that biodiversity stretches into other areas of the city as well, across everything. So getting away from this kind of almost like zoning mindset that we have trapped ourselves in with cities, thinking about, you know, here's a place for this and here's a place for that. And I think what you said is so important. One of the things that really excited me about this conversation is that each of you are doing, you know, such interesting work in different areas, kind of all sort of interrelated. And I'm wondering how does, and we've sort of touched on this a little bit, but how does the relationship between humans, biodiversity, and nature manifest in the work that you do? And has COVID impacted kind of your thinking about this or the way that you do your work? And maybe we'll start with Dawn this time, if that's okay.
Sure, thanks. I mean, what hasn't COVID affected? And so it has affected my thinking just because it's a new lens that you can't avoid. And I guess I'll talk generally. My work has been in looking at how people experience nature in parks and out of parks and how that affects their stewardship values. And bringing those together with biodiversity has really made me think in terms of well-being beyond just health, and in terms of spiritual well-being and community well-being. And COVID has started to really show where those models are starting to break down and where there's some exciting opportunities. I think that the pressure for people to visit parks is an exciting opportunity that obviously people care about it. There's great conversations in the collective in some of our capstone teams right now about whether parks should be essential services. And it's a really wicked problem because that's a complicated thing to set parks up as. And it's brought up questions about the stress and pressures on parks and on park staff themselves. So I think right now I'm kind of in the middle of COVID saying, I sure hope we take some lessons out of this to make sure the park systems can be prepared to be part of these public health conversations. And I hope we're taking out of this some really sobering examination of the pressures and the assumptions we make about who should access parks and how people need to take more responsibility when they come to parks, and how people who take care of parks feel the burden of that service, how those caretakers themselves can get worn down, and what can we do to make sure that they're being supported. And of course, that's the work that I do, is working with those park leaders. So COVID's raised a lot of those really exciting questions that, like I said, I hope we can learn coming out of it, how to strengthen that system of well-being.
Thank you, Don. Jennifer?
Okay, thanks. There was some weird pop-ups coming up. So I think that during this COVID time, I've had the opportunity with the Urban Biodiversity Hub to meet with several of the leaders that are involved in setting targets for biodiversity and setting indicators at the global scale, and also who work with city organizations around the world. And we were kind of talking about, okay, what now? What's happening with COVID, and how does this impact what we should be doing or talking about? And there was a strong movement that now is the time to step back, and that human issues, human health issues, human livelihood issues should be at the forefront and are at the spotlight at this time. And that it wasn't the time to go bothering officials about what they should be doing about biodiversity. And I found this quite bothersome, actually, because I find it to be more of one of these moments of opportunity and of catalyzation of things, wherein there's an opportunity for change, to emphasize how biodiversity connects to these other issues, and that it's not a time to shy back, but rather one to challenge ourselves and say, if biodiversity is truly important to who we are as humans, then it should be extra important now when we're questioning these things. It brings up a conversation that I had with one of the Syrian national environmental experts and managers for the Syrian government. And during this time, this was at a convention, and the country of Syria was at war and going through a crisis. And I asked this gentleman, what work is there to do right now for environment with your country in conflict? And, how is it that you prioritize those things? And for him, he just saw that the whole reason why, we're here and what we're fighting for is issues like this. And if we drop them in times of crisis, then we reveal the true values that we're holding. So I would say that now is a time to step up and to show how nature is truly connected to the really significant things that make us human, in terms of not only mental and physical well-being, but just who we are and how it is to be on this earth and to be in right relationship. So to be there when this rebuilding is happening and to be prepared when it's time to rethink the way our society operates, to be ready with a strategy and a plan, that now is that time. So that was my takeaway from the COVID happenings and how that impacts what Urban Biodiversity Hub does.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, again, moving more towards that sort of interconnected thinking approach and away from this kind of siloed way of thinking of this is over here and this is over here, but actually thinking about how they are so intricately connected. Nadha, how about you?
Thanks, Jake. Yeah, I think that definitely when we start to think about this work, and in particular for me, I think about urban green spaces and the link to mental health and well-being, we know that the higher biodiversity tends to increase psychological restorative benefits. But I also think that what tends to happen when we think about nature is that we romanticize it. We romanticize the fact that it's a beautiful space, and sometimes we assume that everyone feels the same way in these spaces, but that just isn't the case. Our lived realities, our lived experiences are just so different that we often have to think about how different people navigate and perceive public spaces. And so, for instance, for me, if I might go to the same space as someone else, I would experience it a particular way than, say, someone who's my age but uses a mobility device, or let's say a senior. And I think when you asked the question about COVID, I think when I'm thinking about health inequities, COVID has absolutely worsened and exacerbated the health inequities that we've been seeing. Because even prior to this pandemic, we knew a couple of things. We knew that mental health and social isolation, those sorts of issues were on the rise in urban environments. But we also knew that the inequities between different neighborhoods in terms of green space access, in terms of how green spaces are created and maintained across different neighborhoods in different cities, isn't equitable. And so they're not experienced the same way. And so I think that when we put that together, we know that these inequities are often along racial and income lines. And we've seen that, in Toronto, for example, with the 3 Cities report. So really when we're starting to think about how this summer highlighted how people were trying to access public urban green spaces in a safe way, there was also this movement of how highlighting how racism plays out, and highlighting how, if we think about the instance even in New York with Christian Cooper, who was a Black man who was bird watching and had the police falsely called on him. And we see how these moments in time come together and really highlight how these are structural and systemic issues that we need to address when we're starting to move forward through this. So I think when we think about who has access to certain resources like biodiverse, quality urban green spaces, also think about who has the privilege to experience these health benefits or the positive attributes, and also who gets to be a part of the decision making and who gets to contribute to solutions.
Yes, such important points for sure. And I think, that one about decision making is certainly one that I want to come back to in a later question. Something just before Joss, something that I just wanted to mention is, we did a survey in the summer of 1,600 Canadians, and one of the things that came out of that survey around park use and COVID was that people without a park within a 5-minute walk were 5 times more likely to not have visited a park at all. during the pandemic. And so really, that's obviously a small slice of thinking about sort of park equity in an access kind of way, but that was a pretty stark statistic for us of people who have access to these spaces and don't. Joss, how does the relationship between humans, biodiversity, and nature manifest in your work, and how has COVID changed that thinking or at all?
Yeah, it's a big question, and I have like such a tremendous stream of consciousness that I can feel coming up from behind me. I want to say miigwech actually Nehogwa to these other three lovely people who have shared awesome stuff. I feel like I was nodding vigorously about it and doing a lot of twinkle fingers. For me, in my work in this city and in and around this city, I am primarily working with Indigenous community and their kin, so not always their chosen family, not always just exclusively Indigenous, but really centering, prioritizing Two-Spirit, Indigiqueer, and Indigenous trans, Indigenous women, and their families, because in our community they are the most vulnerabilized, not vulnerable, they're actually like next level warrior survivors, but systemically they of course are vulnerabilized. And in COVID we have certainly experienced like skyrocketing mental health stuff coming down on our people that is part and parcel with also a rise in anti-Indigenous violence that is happening. Just before COVID dropped, we were seeing actually a kind of increased solidarity, as I would say, sparked by Wet'suwet'en, Stoughton like land defense, and having witnessed that here in the city, and then experiencing a shutdown for all land defense that was happening. And of course, it's continued, and it's a forced to reckon with that kind of resistance. It's very resilient. But I just want to speak to this piece that wherein mental health, and of course an element that has really come up in community research or surveying mental health in Toronto in particular with Indigenous folks, wherein we do have more Indigenous people in Toronto than anywhere else, even though of course Winnipeg per capita has more people in that space, but the GTA has a lot of Indigenous peoples in this space. And census have shown us that Indigenous people are primarily, due to systemic racism, being marginalized into low-income neighborhoods that rarely have very much green space. They are concrete, spaces. And so that is a fact that impacts our people. And that has, this has already been touched, implications on people's mental health realities and their wellness. And that is a really real thing to consider. That was before COVID. Now with COVID, for sure, limitations to that movement, ability to access green spaces has also been hindered. Now for the past several decades, in my experience in the past 20 years, specifically in Toronto, like Indigenous community have not felt safe to come out into green spaces and rock their colors. That even 3 Indigenous peoples remotely visible in those ways having a cigarette together frequently had the police called on them, wherever they were, whether they were in their own neighborhoods or not. So just to recognize that. Now, a major factor with COVID has like actually brought up some intergenerational trauma around like survivor guilt, surviving epidemics. That's something that impacted for generations Indigenous people, actually. Some nations completely wiped out, some so few people remaining within that nation. So to carry forward that trauma, to carry forward that grief, is a real thing that's come up for people too, wherein they are limited in their access to good food and again to green space, those things that would help them in their wellness. So I feel like it's really, really important to recognize some of the work that our community has done, but specifically our Indigenous women, 2S, Indigenous trans, Indigiqueer folks specifically want to speak to the inquiry with a report on the inquiry into missing murdered Indigenous women, girls, 2S plus peoples, which really, really, really from the beginning all the way through spoke and aligned a kind of mirroring the desecration that we see happening on the land through industrial processes is being replicated on the bodies of all relatives carrying divine feminine, whether that's a dairy cow or an egg-laying chicken or trees that are deemed as too messy because they're female trees in the landscape to our own human bodies. So I just want to recognize that, because the nation state of Canada has struggled to be able to acknowledge its perpetuation of cultural genocide, which has not ceased. It has never slowed down, from the foster care system to man camps all around our nations in the north. So as that relates to Toronto and what I've experienced trying to continue to connect people to the land, because I've never been invested in trying to make people work or do anything in particular, literally just trying to lift barriers that are preventing them from getting to land. And when I say land, I mean green spaces, because of course the land is everywhere, and I can do ceremony on the land from my bedroom, and I encourage my community members to do that too. Since COVID dropped, our faith keepers have been saying, do your ceremonies now more than ever, that we need that to keep that spirit energy vital and to be able to connect with one another, to not lose hope, because we need that so that we don't see that ongoing spike in suicidality, which is, of course, like a major factor in what has been happening for Indigenous peoples well before COVID, and it has also incredibly increased. And we see, again, those are most vulnerabilized people, where folks are intersectionally racialized, street involved, substance using, young people, and if they are in any way gender non-conforming or not gender binary, their ability to stay in their body is 30 plus times at greater risk than any other person in the nation state of Canada. So those peoples are primarily displaced also to urban centers, that is to say our two-spirit youth coming from reserve lands where, thanks to Judeo-Christianity and again colonial assimilation tactics, that they're not safe in their homelands. So they come here as a diaspora to try and, you know, find some safety, and are predominantly falling through cracks and street involved. They're closer to the land, and they actually, like, it's important to destigmatize. To be a shelter user as an Indigenous person is not the same for other peoples. In fact, it provides an ongoing kind of mobility or a freedom of movement, which is ancestral on these lands. And there's, again, so many things that I want to share. At some point, I really want to share a graphic about work in High Park, but I think so as not to like overwhelm, I'm just going to leave it at that. Yep.
Thank you, Joss. Yeah, I want to continue in like kind of diving a little bit deeper into this issue of urban equity and inclusion around this topic. And I think we've seen heightened conversations about this in the last year as the impacts of COVID, as Nadha pointed out, have magnified many of the already existing inequities that were in our cities, including around urban parks. And often when we talk about equity in terms of urban nature, people are sort of going to that issue of access. I highlighted that stat earlier, for instance, who has a natural area within a certain minute walk, or who has neighborhoods that are greener than others, more trees, that sort of thing. I'm wondering, though, what equity and inclusion in urban nature looks like for you and your work. Is it about measuring that access issue, or are there other factors that are at play with the work that you're undertaking? Nadha, maybe we'll go to you here, just because we were just sort of talking about this a few minutes ago with you.
Yeah, there's so much to say, and I think this conversation could go on for a long time. I think for me, with my work, I'm interested in the experiences of people who are racialized in these spaces, because I think that access is complicated by concepts like safety or belonging. And I think that there also needs to be, in speaking to the point that Josh just made, like there needs to be solidarity with the increase in anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism is so heartbreaking. And that is also for other people who are not part of that group, I identify as racialized, but I can't experience the same thing. There are hierarchies of racism and there's a history there. And so part of the work is to be uncomfortable and figure out how to do this, standing alongside behind these people who are doing important work and with Black and Indigenous communities and folks. And so I think that there are so many questions, and I think it starts with having important conversations. And when I think about this work, I also think about, how this engagement tends to happen. Like for me, I grew up in an apartment in an urban center. I still live in an apartment, 30 floors up in the air, and I often feel disconnected from urban green spaces. I often feel like there's a physical separation to getting involved in a lot of this work. I know that there's also issues around how to be involved in this work, because sometimes people are working, if you're in survival mode, it's very challenging to start to think about conservation and biodiversity. Not for everyone, it's definitely interconnected. But I think about how it might be intimidating for some people as well to get involved in this. And I do think it comes back to how growth comes from being uncomfortable. Growth comes from learning and learning to sit in that discomfort and unlearn histories and figure out how to work together. So there's a lot there. There's a lot there in unpacking, I think, this concept of biodiversity, urban green spaces, the link to human mental health and physical health and well-being, access, inclusion, and also how we relate to other relational species, the planet, and other species as well, and not kind of getting too caught up in the human-centered aspect of it.
Thank you, Nadha. Don, what about you? What does equity and inclusion mean in your work?
Well, I building on what Nada's saying, I think what's been transformative to me in my work with parks over coming on 30 years now in different systems is how important it is to start with empathy when you start looking at equity. It starts with putting aside our own assumptions, really understanding the privilege. And this is, coming from me in one of the most privileged positions as a, white male, cisgendered man. I have a lot of privileged lenses that I need to put aside and just to listen and listen with empathy. And nature in parks is such a great place to start with that because of the empathetic relationship we can have with nature when we start appreciating the needs of bears and the needs of creeks and the needs of systems around us. And to take that into something maybe more tangible, equity to me, and where urban parks play an exciting role, is in fostering a sense of belonging. I remember being challenged by people with disabilities in a focus group about a visitor center design who said, this is great that you're making your visitor center more accessible for visitors, but I want to work here. Make it accessible behind the counter. And that's what a lot of the urban parks that I've been able to work with have shown me, and it's especially with the community groups that get involved with them, is they become such an interesting place for belonging and for people to be part of a community, like a friends of group. And even then there's still questions of access and equity to who can be part of those groups, but it becomes a really neat space within an urban park to build community, to build belonging, and to understand empathetically what other people are going through and how they experience parks and how they experience life. And so for me, equity is about bringing people into those spaces on both sides of the counter where they're involved in the park's experience and the conservation experience.
Thank you, Don. Yeah, I think that goes back to what Nadha was talking about when she mentioned decision-making. Is it purely about access, or are people having those, being able to be included on, as you said, sort of both sides of the counter and have that kind of decision-making role as well? Joss, let's go back to you.
Cool. Miigwech for sharing, everyone. I wanted to preface what I'm going to talk about just by saying that in my research, I work with a group called Diagon Historical Preservation Society. It's a mouthful. And we are a group that is led by Onkweonwe Haudenosaunee faith keepers, seated faith keepers, overseeing sacred sites in Toronto, but specifically in what is called High Park and along the Humber River or Niawa Onegagai, and also on other rivers, but those are our primary spaces where we're working, just given the capacities that we have. And I want to also preface that this city has in the past 20 years endorsed or accepted 13 different documents made by and for the Indigenous community that reiterates what the public can see all of these documents. It reiterates the findings of actually the Royal Commission, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, again, the MMIW G2S Plus report, and then some. There's also, anyways, all this to say, reiterating the significance of Indigenous people having connection to the land in order to preserve their cultural customs, their ceremonies, and their languages. Without access to land, none of those things can move forward into futurity. So I just want to make that really super clear. So I work in Hyde Park, and I've been working for about 15 years, really intentionally trying to bring voice back to that park. And I'm just going to hold up this cute pamphlet here, Hyde Park pamphlet. Every year another pamphlet comes out that makes no mention whatsoever of anything to do with Indigenous people. There are some stuff online that the stewards which is a very interesting name that they take up. They make a very ahistorical reference to Indigenous people as having perhaps contributed to the making of the Black Oak Savanna, which is an incredibly rare ecosystem and a very precious one to have in Toronto. So this is High Park. It's a little squared in border with streets all around it. This is the most recent pamphlet that came out of High Park. Enraging, given that we have been working and meeting with various councils and groups to try and get them to understand that Indigenous people have not disappeared into the past. We're still here, we're still working, and we ought to be included. Now, that might seem like us, I don't know how that lands with people, but what I really want to clarify is that High Park is an ancestral sacred lands. Within the borders of what is remaining, that's this tiny fragment, are 50 plus and like sacred mounds, ceremonial mounds, burial mounds. That in and of itself is already really important. There are also ancestral footpaths, and we continue to do ceremony. We never stop doing ceremony. We've just been doing them under the veil of darkness or hiding as a shadow, like taking up coyote medicine. But I want to point out, and I'm going to share this little, I'm going to do my best to share this little graphic here. Can I do it? I hope so. Sharing. Okay. So I want to give props to my youth mentee, Catherine Yee, who put this together. And we've been talking about this all summer. We've been talking about space in High Park. So you can see the little legend here. So the purple sections are, and I actually wanted to separate tennis courts.
It looks like we're seeing the window, but not the image.
Not the image.
The menu, the side menu. I don't know if you can maybe try sharing that again, or if you might be able to send it to, or share it with Rachel, and she might be able to share it with folks.
Okay, I'm getting some help from my my Zaggy. Better?
Yes, now we can see the image.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so I want to actually say something that's really interesting about settler colonial landscape today is that often the only thing we have that commemorates Indigenous presence is street names. So we have Algonquin Road and we have Indian Valley Crescent Road along the eastern side of the park. We have Indian Trail Road, we have Wendigo Way, we have Indian Road, Indian Grove, and Indian Grove Crescent. And these border all around the park. And yet the park itself is quite literally sanitized and whitewashed of Indigenous presence. So over here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but over here on the east side, we've got not one, not two, but 3 tennis courts. They're courts within which each has 4 courts within the terrain. There's more over here. All this purple ended up being a representation of athletic spaces, each one of those taking up quite a lot of actual square footage for only very few human people to be on them. We have this whole yellow section, which is dog off leash. It's quite extensive. The red being parking. These are just like a few areas. So cars, dogs, and a few people playing sports. That's all the space they have. You'll note that there is no marked space on here for Indigenous people. Nothing. There's nothing designated for Indigenous people. Not a single space. Not a sign, not a single mention in this entire space, by which like the concept of Toronto as a meeting place is based on how Indigenous peoples that were coming together for the Dish with One Spoon, that's 80 plus different nations. That's not even just the 6 nations, which is Mohawk, Seneca, Oneida, Onondaga, Tuscarora, Cayuga, 80 plus different nations that converged here. And we're doing so well before settler colonial peoples came to these lands. And they met here for trade and to exchange and ceremony. And today we have nothing but street signs to indicate that history. That history is not in the past. It's not ahistorical. We expect and intend for it to be about a futurity where we're not just making spaces where we can come in for 3 hours or maybe half an hour once a week or once a month, but places we can continue to return to so we can survive our young people into the future, into 7 generations. So I also put in here Phragmites, and this is just a bit of the Phragmites. And I want to speak to the Phragmites because this is an opportunity to talk about writing relations. So Phragmites, for anyone who knows, is a relative that gets labeled as this invasive, noxious plant, and we need to go to war with it. We need to mow it, we need to burn it, we need to dump glyphosate on it, a known carcinogen by the World Health Organization. And there's quite a movement actually on the planet, it's building, it's mounting, to really address the health concerns of glyphosate. That's very humanistic though. To consider actually what glyphosate does to the soil science, what it does to the life of the soil, and that it ironically actually just exacerbates the problem. Whereas Indigenous folks have actually been from Walpole Island to I'm not going to go into naming nations, but throughout southwestern Ontario have been managing Phragmites. And in fact, Phragmites is a sacred relative. It's a plant that we have been using for some time. And it's an opportunity just to think about how we relate to any single relative. When we send that kind of intention, when we stigmatize a plant, it's not different than stigmatizing Indigenous people. So they've decided Phragmites shouldn't be there. They've decided Indigenous people shouldn't be there. And when we come back to what my fellow panelists have been speaking about, who's at the table, or rather, more importantly, who's in the circle? A teaching that we have about the sacredness of the circle is we never accept that the circle is closed. It's always meant to be open, and we're always wanting to ask ourselves, who's not here, and what can we do to assure that they can be here next time? What barriers need to be lifted? What ally accomplices do we need to call in to resource, making sure we have more of our elders, more of our young people, etc., that we have proper culturally appropriate means to address conflict as it comes up, because we are all carrying a lot of colonial wounds. How can we make space to decolonize our hearts and our minds and simultaneously re-indigenize our hearts and our minds? And that's not just for the human peoples, for the plant relatives, it's for even the minerals, the relatives that have been sustaining us all this time. So I just really wanted to speak to some of those contradictions on the land itself. And I shared on here, specifically, I want to share this Nishin, Violence on the Land, Violence on Our Bodies. Nishin is the Native Youth Sexual Health Network. It's an excellent report for people to read. And if you don't already know about UNDRIP, and again, the Inquiry Report, the MMIW 2S Plus report, please, to all our sector allies, become accomplices, do that work so that you can learn how to appropriately connect to Indigenous community. I'm definitely going to speak to more, I hope anyways, about how and why that is so urgently critical right now. I'm going to close this now.
Thank you so much for that, Joss. I don't know if you're monitoring the chat, but there's a lot of conversation going on. And, you know, for folks who asked, there will be a recording of this afterwards if you want to go back and watch. We are coming up, unfortunately, at the end of the hour. I can't believe it. I wish we had another hour, and I think probably by the conversation in the chat, most people also wish that. I just want to thank you all so much for such a great conversation, and in wrapping things up, and keeping in mind we have very little time left, so maybe just sharing a couple of words, you know, what you're coming away from this conversation with. And for me, it's about interconnection. It's about drawing on sort of the emotional experience of nature and thinking about who's, you know, in the circle, as Joss was saying. So if we could maybe each go around and just very quickly kind of our takeaway from this conversation of what we hope to leave people with. And we'll start with Dawn.
There's opportunities for action, and it's time to take action on these themes.
Yep.
Thank you, Nadha.
I agree. It's important to move forward and start to take action, thinking about questioning our existing ideas about who belongs where, who gets access to what resources, who gets to participate in conservation efforts, and how do we work respectfully and meaningfully together.
Jennifer.
I didn't get the opportunity to answer the last question, so I'm sorry if I take a little bit more time. I did want to thank Joss for his conversation about these issues, and to sort of also point out that Hyde Park is not unique in its issues. In my research, I study how biodiversity plans are put together and how cities communicate about biodiversity and who is welcome in that conversation and who isn't. So I have behind me an image that was drawn for the city of Calgary in their biodiversity plan. And I think it's a perfect example of what's welcome. We see people doing leisure activities, hobby activities in natural spaces. We don't see people harvesting. We don't see ceremony. We don't see healing. We don't see multicultural activities in these spaces. And this is the message that we're sending people. So I think that, you know, we know, and people of color, Indigenous people have been shouting from the rooftops what they need. So I find that when I speak with people of color, dialogue is not what they're looking for, because they have already been through dialogue so many times. And it's time now for leaders in this area, for the primarily white people that run these spaces, to actually bring these people the people of color and Indigenous people into positions of power where they can make decisions, instead of saying, we're listening to you, okay, now go away, we'll make the decisions. So that for me is the call to action, is to actually start doing instead of the tokenized talking.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Joss, just a few words as a takeaway.
Whew, just a few. Okay. What I really want to speak to is that food security actually it must center Indigenous food sovereignty, Indigenous land sovereignty, that we are holding not just like rematriated or repatriated heritage seeds, but the ability to unlock those seeds. And so as ally accomplices, we are all treaty people. The state has never upheld the treaties. It was always meant to be a nation to nation between human peoples, make them alive, enact them, get into relationships with Indigenous people and support them getting on the land, resource them getting on the land. I just want to say this one thing, which is that the UN, in their assessments of climate change, have recognized that Indigenous people, and I already said this, need to be at the center of all like decision making, of all assessments and consultations around what we're doing with what bit of biodiversity we have left. So wherever anyone is doing any work to conserve, preserve biodiversity, you must bring Indigenous people into it. They can't come in at the end. If you've already started your work and you haven't brought them in, then pause and connect to genuine Indigenous peoples on the land. Bring them in, please, please, please. That's all I want to say.
Thank you, Joss. And again, thank you all so much for this conversation, and you know, for I talked to many of you for the report as well. Just so grateful, and I learned a ton. And Joss is sharing a book, I believe, on the screen to read.